Yeah, I'm Mikael Jakobsson. I'm 50 years old on the dot, and I'm from northern Sweden. Um, I went to college there, computer science undergrad. Uh, Moved on to studying interaction design and design aspects of information technology. So I became interested in online systems where a lot of people hang out with each other over long periods of time. So what we would call virtual worlds at the time. So that made me start studying games around 2000 when EverQuest came out. It was at the time the kind of systems that people migrated towards from just having been doing like general purpose chat worlds to game worlds, because that became a reason for people to go to these places, and then they found the community aspects of it once they were there that made them stick around. So that was in the middle of my dissertation work. So I sort of drifted from internet studies to game studies, and that's where I've been ever since.
Yeah.
I started going to game studies conferences and publishing in those journals, which were becoming a thing at the time, and that's sort of where I landed when it comes to my academic community.
Gotcha. Yeah, and we met last year, and we talked a little bit about, I think my, even though I started this project to do interviews ostensibly about games stuff, if you'll allow me to be vague, we meet kind of in the middle of maybe my sort of doing the opposite, which is like trying to aim a lens of looking deeply at game stuff, at, I guess, things that would fall under the purview of, internet studies. And so I think this is a big thing that we talked about last time, but I don't think I really directly asked you this, and this might be a good place to start, which is coming at it the inverse way that you did. How do you feel, or do you feel, that those earlier virtual worlds that you were looking at 20 years ago, were there ways that they presaged the internet that we're all living in or trying to figure out how to live with now?
I very much think so. I think the scale was very different, so we didn't really realize the impact these sort of early social networking systems on the net were going to be.
Yeah.
But I see direct connections between games like EverQuest and social media platforms like Facebook, for instance.
Yeah.
It was kind of an early experiment on which I don't think the developers were at all aware of what kind of pleasures they were tapping into. I think they had this dream that they wanted to make a lot of people connect from all over the world in the same virtual environment, but really the impact that would have and how popular it would become, I don't think anyone ever sort of, even in our sort of predictions where we tried to swing big, we would
Right.
say that someday there will be hundreds of thousands of people in the same virtual world at the same time or whatever, but we're still just lowballing it.
Yeah, it's hard to conceive of a future that we don't yet live in, and much less be like, yeah, that's the target we're going to hit. But I feel like, if I'm understanding what you do correctly, as a research scientist at MIT Game Lab, I am interested in those ways of like how are we understanding or misunderstanding where we're heading. I'm just curious. I would be curious to hear you just talk a little bit about like how maybe when you talk to people outside of academia, like how do people misunderstand what a research scientist at MIT Game Lab does? Like what are you always having to explain to people what you really do and how their assumptions might be wrong? I mean, I'm going to guess maybe you do or don't get accused of like sitting around in sweatpants all day playing games.
Yeah, that's kind of the first comment I usually get.
I'm sorry.
Like how fun it must be.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it's a real misunderstanding or if it's just kind of a surface sort of reaction to mentioning games. That I think if people thought about it for a minute, they would. I'm sure they would realize that we don't play that much games, although we really, really work hard to try to play games in the lab every week.
Yeah.
But it's a momentous task just to try to get enough people together to have an hour to spare just at one point every week. So it's rough, but yeah, that's sort of the level it's at.
What about for students coming into your orbit? I mean, are there ways that they misunderstand either the scope of what you do or maybe overestimate some sort of dynamic about the reality of being in the field in some way?
Right, yeah. So I think it's interesting with students because I think the more of sort of a gamer immersed in the gaming community and maybe also making their own games they are, I feel the more we have to have them unlearn all these presuppositions that they have about what it means to study games or understand gaming and so on. It's almost easier if you have a blank slate, someone coming in and saying, well, I've played games, but not that much. So tell me what it's all about, because as I'm sure you're aware, there's out on the forums on the internet, there's a lot of little experts speculating wildly about what a good game is or why people play games and what games should be and so on.
Right.
And there's a lot of sort of dismantling that has to happen before we can start building it up in a more academically sort of viable or sensible way.
Well, are there, I mean, some of this may have to do too with like what paths exist or don't yet exist for students exploring, a career in the ecosystem in general. I would just be curious to hear, like, are there, like, what new paths do you wish did exist, like, right now for students, like, entering a program like the one that you're in?
Right. So I even feel like these paths have emerged to some extent, but one thing I do is I teach game criticism.
Yeah.
And I also wrote game reviews for a large Swedish morning newspaper when I was still living in Sweden. I did that for 10 years, sort of on top of my academic career. And at the time, I would say games journalism was very weak. And part of it was because there was no higher educational foundation for people who went into games writing. So the idea was more that if you're really interested in games, then you can become a games writer. And that doesn't really sort of set the stage for a deeper critical analysis of the medium and its role in society. So that's something that we and others are trying to do. Just create or almost think of it as inoculating students against some of the industry bullshit, just so they are aware of it from the get-go, rather than being sort of lured into this system of games writing and having to sort of unwillingly become a pawn in the powers of commerce around games that I'm sure you are fairly well aware of as well with your background.
Are you saying I'm aware of a lot of bullshit, or I peddle a lot of bullshit?
You are probably aware of it more than being a peddler, but I mean, when I did my sort of, this was around the time of Gamergate.
Yeah.
And I had a lecture on the sort of the reality of games criticism in the industry. Mm-hmm. And it was a little bit of a sort of 70-minute rant about bot reviews and all the kinds of pressures you're put under as a game reviewer, and why they are hard to withstand, and how it's not really any one person who is at fault, but the system is deeply corrupt. And I asked at the end, oh, by the way, is it someone, because you can take the class without really having the intentions of becoming a games critic. I said, is there anyone who actually thinks of doing this for a living? And one guy in the back of the class said, "Oh, not anymore." So that wasn't quite what I was going for, but yeah, at the time things were pretty dark.
What's your sense of that sort of industry bullshit now? Like, I would be curious to hear, because I know nothing about what it's like writing for Swedish publications for a decade. I mean, I'd be curious to just hear it sort of compared. Like, does it feel like, in countries like the U.S., how does it differ for those types of opportunities versus places like publications you're writing for in Sweden? I mean, do we seem more in lockstep and willing to go along with the bullshit here in U.S., or is it hard to compare because you're talking about, 10 years before you came here or something like that?
Right. Yeah. No, I think it's very similar, and the trajectories have been the same as well. I mean, since then we've had the death of the game magazines. They just don't kind of exist anymore.
Right.
But we also in Sweden, there's Game Informer and those things that you get for free in the brick and mortar stores. So there's a lot of it is the same, and we also have in Sweden, thankfully, this emergence of independent writing online about games that is usually the best writing you can get hold of. We even had we sort of had our version of Kill Screen. It was a magazine called The Enemy that was just focused on really long, in-depth writing about games, and not necessarily reviews, more just like following the work in a studio in Russia on the new game or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it was amazing, but I think it was just not commercially viable to do that in print anymore, so it didn't last long.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's commercially viable to do it online anymore. But we don't need to do a deep dive on that. I'm interested because you're actually sort of naturally taking us to a topic that I know you wanted to
Right.
talk a bit about. And so, you mentioned Sweden, you mentioned some of your experience here in the United States, and so you mentioned that you've also taught game design in Colombia. And I do want to get to this topic of colonialism that you said you wanted to discuss, but I'm just interested from just these three different cultures that you're bringing into this conversation. I mean, what do you think generally we in the U.S. take for granted around conversations about games, either as a lifestyle or as a career or just something to think seriously about?
Right. I think in relation to the Colombia project, I think something that sort of falls in between things a little bit is making games that are about real things and can work as a way of processing what's happening around us, but aren't educational games or like games for impact or something like that, because I feel like that's a very established field of we're making games that aren't primarily here to be just fun, and then there are all the other games. Mm-hmm. But this sort of in-between field of somewhat documentary or somewhat representational games that just deal with issues that should be of interest to people in general, that hasn't really sort of established itself as a very strong voice, neither in digital video games or in board games. But that's where I see sort of signs of something happening, and that's where I'm very interested in making something happen.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about like video or board games that take place in Colombia, but they're never actually about Colombia. And you say that like the country serves as an exotic playground for Westerners to have adventures in without consequences, and it serves to erase the actual Colombia and the Western mindset. So, I mean, how do people in Colombia that you've talked about this with, like, just to take one example, like how do they feel about this sort of pattern?
Well, so part of teaching this class was bringing up some examples that I was familiar with of games that take place in Colombia, or something that is called something else but inspired by Colombia. And there was a lot of sort of amused acknowledgement of this. So it's clearly something that they are aware of. It's either drug trafficking or some kind of just the violence and the sort of banana republic kind of idea of the government and the police and military all being evil and corrupt, and then they said, or there's alpacas. There's there's no in between. So there's cute alpaca games as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you said before you started working on this particular project, I think you said it occupies 83% of your brain right now. Mm-hmm. You said before you started on this project, you didn't really think about these things too much, and now you see it everywhere. Can you just sort of talk through how you started to see it everywhere and how it went from 0% to 83% of your brain?
Yeah. I started thinking about, my first realization was in board games specifically that, oh my God, there's so many board games about the European colonialist era. Why is that such an incredibly popular topic, and it really is, because when I first started looking at it, I could sort of think of around 10 titles. So I thought we should play those games and then I should write something about it.
Yeah.
But while we were going through those 10 games, I found another 90 and realized that this had to be a book project.
Yeah.
And today, I don't know the exact count, but I think I have about 300 games on my list, all board games. And I've managed to acquire around 200 of them. And we've played, I think, 61. This seems to be another constant. We're always at 61% of completion. So for every game we play, I find another one to add to the list. But then the first thing I was thinking about was, why is this? Because it's counterintuitive to me. The colonialist time period was so bleak, it can't get much bleaker than that. Genocide, concentration camps, whaling, spreading of disease, just slaughtering of innocent people and children, and it's just, and of course just taking their land. So it doesn't seem like a good topic for a sort of nice family fun kind of entertainment product. So I was thinking about the people who make these games, and they tend to come from Europe, like myself. They tend to be white men of roughly my age as well. So I was thinking about my youth and childhood and the toys and media and culture I existed in, and the racism and colonialist mindset was just in everything.
Yeah.
It's in candy wrappers. It's in sports team uniforms. That's true here as well.
Yeah.
And it's, of course, in comic books and in the movies and in the books and including school books. The books we read in history class was full of it as well. So that, I think, makes it a little easier to understand. We also have this effect of how our view of the world kind of is cemented during our school years,
right,
and then doesn't really get updated very well after that. So that, I think, is, if you're just swimming in it constantly through your whole childhood, that maybe makes it reasonable to understand that that's then what we're going to choose as themes when we make board games.
Right.
Especially if we don't really care about the theme of it. We're really interested in the mechanics and how people who play the game interact with the game and with each other, and then we just need to slap something onto it because
right,
it won't sell if it's just an abstract game.
Well, I think it's like some mix of either not caring or just like a fish not knowing it's in water.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I think, of course, there's other reasons as well. There's been these big successes that happen to have this theme, so then the publishers want to go with the same theme, and
right,
and the reviewers don't ding them on it. Now we're back to having board game criticism not being up to the level, critical level where I would wish that it was at, where people actually questioned these kinds of themes, but they don't. They are much more interested in, is the board colorful, or the pieces of good quality? If maybe something comes through that the sense could be offensive. The furthest they would go is saying something like, "Be a little careful with who you play this game with. Some might get offended." So basically, dog whistling that you should only play this with white people, or you might have a less pleasant time.
Yeah, I was wondering how much of you're feeling like you're not seeing a lot of people dinging them on that is like possibly people being aware of it, but not either feeling like not confident in like how to criticize them, or not feeling it's their place to criticize it. You know, I mean that's speculative, but you've done more research on it than I have.
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to board game criticism, it stems from war game hobbyists that has existed in this country for a long time and very well established, especially in the Midwest.
Yeah,
and the ethos and ethics of those games is that it's very patriotic and kind of Robert Heinlein Starship Troopers kind of rah, let's fight the evil, communists at the time, but of course represented as space dogs in that case. But it comes from that background, and I think religion plays a part in it as well, sort of fostering certain values, and also the whole sort of exceptionalism and so on plays into it as well. On top of all that, I think that there is a little bit of let's not rock the boat, because it's another thing in board gaming culture that often one of the house rules is that we don't discuss politics while we play games. For I think probably good reasons that can derail things pretty badly, I think. But that also becomes this, okay, I noticed something in this game that I'm not comfortable with, but we're just supposed to play nice and not get upset and not voice concerns.
I mean, obviously there's a parallel tradition of let's not bring politics into it in the video game ecosystem. Pretty infamously. I mean, I can remember, around the time I started doing these interviews 5 or so years ago. I remember just sort of being out and about at like a GDC or something and just sort of talking to people about like, oh yeah, I'm about to start doing this thing, and it would be interesting to gauge what people's reaction would be, which is like, I hope you're not bringing politics into it. I hope you're not talking about like actual issues, because I think there was a very long tradition of that in writing and thinking and talking about games. Obviously, that's changed. But given that this occupies, a significant portion of your brain now, these themes, how do people usually react when you point it out, either to students or to others in the field or others outside the field? What are the kind of responses that you get when you just try to broach this topic?
All right. So at GDC, for instance, when we were presenting the project there was almost no negative feedback.
Yeah.
And I knew it wasn't going to be a hostile environment, but I knew it was going to, even if it's a self-selected audience that comes to a talk like this, I knew it was going to ruffle some feathers. Because, the slides were showing examples from some of the designers in the audience.
Right.
But I think that the sort of overall decorum was that we can't, have outbursts here. I'm going to be in a minority if I say something negative. So there's probably a few of them, clenching their fist in their pockets, but there was very, very little sort of direct negative comments. Someone in the anonymous feedback said we maybe should went a little unnecessarily graphic into the horrendous aspects of the colonialist era, but that was as far as it went, and that's been a theme for like all the classes and workshops and stuff I've been doing. I feel like there are certain places I could go where that would not be the case.
Yeah.
I know on some board game forums online, if you start bringing these things up, there's a lot of people showing up to try to shut you down and get threads locked and things like that. So I think I've just been sort of not in hostile enough waters bringing these things up.
Does that concern you? I mean, do you feel like, not that you want to be threatened or anything like that, do you feel like that's important to like road test your work, is to to experience more headwinds or to experience more scrutiny or more skepticism?
Yeah. No, I mean, once the book comes out, I think it will happen then, and I'm not looking forward to it, but yeah, I think it's important to not just sort of preach to the choir.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if, because something else, like I always ask everyone I talk to, like, oh, well, what are ways you feel conversations about games are just sort of stuck or circular? And you brought up, these old canards of, debates over violence or debates over games as art. And I wonder if, like, I wonder, and there's a couple things I wonder. Like, I wonder why maybe it is going on. Like, maybe there are actually people just ignoring it because they recognize it and they know it's just sort of like spoiled leftovers at this point. And so it creates this vacuum where, like, others have to go on the offensive and they feel they have to take up the mantle. But I was also just wondering, like, part of me, like, do people still cling to these, like, at this point, decades-old debates because they know how to argue those things as opposed to, like, the stuff that you're talking about?
Right. Yeah. They know how to do it, and there is still an audience for it. You can still go on lecture tours in here or in Sweden, just being, fear-mongering about games or defending games, and people will show up because the sort of general education level on these topics is still very low. I think it's not something that is taught in school or in general, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking more broadly about, like, well, why are we still having these conversations, Obviously, everyone's journey is different. I mean, I think it's sort of like a media theorist sort of theory, but I remember someone just telling me, like, someone in the industry telling me, like, are we having this argument again? And, like, he sort of speculated there's just something deep in the DNA about the game space where, because when you are starting on a new project, you have to sort of rebuild and retest everything from scratch. I guess this was true maybe a couple of years ago. I don't know so much about now. But he just had this attitude of, like, there's just something in the mentality that, like, in the beacons that attracts people to games that, like, they just feel this need to relitigate all the basics again and again and again. But that's a sort of specious, very nebulous group of people we're talking about happening in spaces we're not even naming. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, when the pendulum will swing back the other way. Or at least just go back towards the middle, if not all the way to the other end. But I don't know. I feel optimistic about these sorts of things, although I don't see that sort of education happening in a more broad sense. I feel like there are more individual, points of data, people like you or me who are out there just sort of pushing forward with those sorts of questions. And I don't think that was really the case, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago to a certain extent.
Yeah. No, I am optimistic myself. I don't want to sound too sort of much doom and gloom about these things, but I do find over and over again that somewhat paradoxically, given that games are, something that's sort of grown out of youth culture and something that has traditionally been the driving force behind new technology to emerge.
Yeah.
It's a very conservative field in many ways. Publishers and developers don't really want to change the formula for what kind of games they are making or how they are making games. And the gaming community and culture are sort of very slow moving in terms of adopt new values or being able to see new perspectives and possibilities in games. There's always this strong force to keep it the same and stick with existing values. I don't know if it's the toxicity of nostalgia or what it really is, or if it is just that games are this thing that is a little suspect and seems to be something that shouldn't be taken too seriously, that just counteracts the things we are trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I feel like there's always this tension of like an insecure tension of like we want more legitimacy, and when we have like the markers of certain forms of legitimacy, we don't want to scrutinize it and talk about like how it could be better, how it could be more meaningful. It's more of a like, well, we don't want to be more we don't want to be more legitimate, we don't want to be more meaningful. Let's just settle for what we can get. And I mean, I often think about too the turbulence and sort of dissonance between how the space and the conversations in it are perceived, if they're perceived at all by whatever passes for the mainstream. I mean, you and I even had a very limited overlap of experience in when I interviewed you previously for an article I had in mind and had pitched, and sort of the way that it changed, which is like people outside of this space, I don't know, there needs to be way more concessions to connect to get more people to care about these things than I think people deep inside of it realize it, which is not a criticism of how that particular article ended up, but I think there's something about the word video game being attached to it that makes people's butts tighten up a bit.
Yeah.
And so I just...
on both sides.
Yes, yeah.
Like in different ways, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I also... I think it comes from if the gaming community, sort of the core of it, has a bit of a just leave us alone attitude. I guess it's understandable because gaming has always been under pressure of being seen as illegitimate or bad for people or whatever it is.
So for things, yeah.
So I guess that's when you sort of circle your wagons, and that becomes a form of gatekeeping that sort of just makes things more conservative.
I mean, I was thinking about, in relation to all this, like how, I mean, it seems very straightforward, like the way you can tell different types of stories about, non-US gaming cultures is just by getting those stories out there. But I feel often like what I see is like you'll see a piece about like basically the headline is like the game industry in X country, it exists.
Right.
And I had the experience a couple of years ago of visiting a gaming convention in Kuwait, and was pretty shocked to find that like nobody was interested in a pitch about like, hey, I spent a couple of days out there and I talked to a ton of people, and here's sort of at least, one person's, temperature taking on what it's like, and it really shows like what we in the West take for granted about like just having conversations about games and thinking about them. I don't know. I mean, it seems like that. I don't want to seem like I'm saying like, oh, every idea I have is great, but it always sort of fascinates me. You can say every idea I have is great. I don't know, but it fascinates me when there are certain parameters that are like, no, we don't want to shift thinking about games in a certain direction. Media is a whole other thing, but I try to think about like, all right, well, what are ways forward? And I don't know if in this case, when it comes to colonialism, it's like dialing down ourselves in some way, or if we think about what our responsibility is. But then you're also operating in the context of a really turbulent, stressful, bleak time in the United States, and I think it was hard enough in the first place to get people to take this sort of stuff seriously outside of the usual pockets. So it's almost like a perfect storm of headwinds,
Yeah, it is, but I also see all these sort of initiatives where people are just chugging along, and I think that's what you have to do, because I think what we're up against is it's very comfortable to have a sort of stereotypical view of the world. We've been living with ideas of a first, second, and third world, for instance, and it sort of fits very easily inside of our brains. And then when people start, like you would go in such minute detail and say that this one country is very, unique and it's doing all these things that no one has heard about, it's almost skipping too many steps where we need to split the world up in like 8 pieces before we can go down on that level for people to sort of keep up.
Yeah.
So I think we're always fighting this like more knowledge equals more effort kind of stream that pushes against us when we try to reshape people's understanding of the world. And stuff like who the good guys and bad guys are. But I still think that the education that kids are getting today in school is better than the one I got. It's a little less sort of ingrained with all these outdated ideas and models, and I don't think there's going to be a big shift. I don't think the tides are suddenly going to turn. I just think that we have to keep chugging against the stream and do whatever little part of it that we can do.
So is the stream, because it's funny, in many of these interviews, people will point to capitalism as the root cause of these types of problems in the ecosystem. So I wonder, is it colonialism or is it capitalism? Because how does colonialism... I think this was actually a question you had asked, which was how does colonialism relate to capitalism, and how does this get expressed in games?
Yeah. I mean, we see examples of games expressing the idea of capitalism, like just exploitation of resources to increase your wealth and maximize your gain and those kinds of things, which is a very common theme in video games.
Yeah.
And how very similar it is to the colonialist endeavor, if we think of it as the 4 X's of 4X games, the exploration, expansion, exploitation, and extinction. So the exploitation part is the same mechanics in both types of games, I think. So there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah. I mean, I think in general the direction, because I don't even think this topic came up when we talked before. Like, I'm always interested in people who are zooming out, because I think one of the obstacles that different outposts of the ecosystem of games doesn't. I don't know. It seems like they're going the other way, where they're zooming in on the individual and the individual's opinion. And I think what we really lose sight of is the bigger pattern of how, like, behaviors get swept under rugs, and then we think that's the, like the whole topic of like toxicity and as it relates to video game fandom. I mean, while certainly true, there's a bigger pattern of just humans being jerks on the internet, period, which I'm sure was true when we were looking at this stuff 20 years ago, but it hadn't reached some sort of critical mass because there weren't as many people online. There weren't as many, avenues of consequence, of ways you could try to ruin someone else's day or life if you felt like it. I don't know. So I don't know if there's something entrenched in the mindset around thinking about games where it was always on the defensive that I don't know, because I guess I'm just curious, like, why games almost sort of embrace this still being thought of as like the boogeyman or the other, or I don't know, maybe that's sort of hypocritical to ask, because I was like, well, why don't we just ignore these dumb accusations or these dumb questions? I mean, maybe everything is worth examining, but I don't know why we don't see more zooming out like you're talking about. Or maybe I'm uninformed and there's a ton of it going on and I just haven't heard of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's always interesting projects going on that we haven't heard of.
Sure.
So I'm sure it's there, but that it hasn't really reached above the surface of our attention means that it's maybe not enough. I think part of it is it's a little hard to know where to begin. Like, I have an undergraduate student who wants to do some kind of design exploration around countering toxicity in gaming communities, and there's just so many aspects that create this phenomenon. So it's hard to just change the direction of one error and try to measure some kind of impact, because it still gets drowned out by all the other errors. So,
right.
I think it's also another thing is, I think that it's so ingrained in, as I said, the actual mechanics that we employ in games, and we have all sort of a personal gaming history we've grown up with and played a certain number of games and a certain type of games, and if those use the mechanics of gather for yourself and defend yourself against others rather than spreading and helping, or whatever the opposite of those verbs would be, then it's hard to even imagine what your game concept would be. It often becomes trying to designate other symbolic meaning to the same mechanics, but maybe we should go even further and try to just come up with new mechanics, new interaction modes, whatever it is that de-emphasizes antagonism in games, which has always been sort of this idea of that's the root of what games are about.
Yeah, I think we should. I mean, one thing I always think of when thinking about something like that is a few years ago interviewing like a 12 or 13-year-old for this project, and I remember asking them, how many genres of video games are you aware of or that you think are out there? And I think people around our age would maybe maybe we could mention 6 or 7, and they thought there was about 2 or 3. So that speaks to maybe a couple of different things, but I think there is this sense of some sort of homogenization happening, which makes sense given the risk involved. And obviously, the more money that comes into the space, the more risk-averse people would get. Look at Hollywood, for example. It's just a peripheral thing. So I think what we're describing are just uncomfortable, sometimes ugly, growing pains for a space that's still relatively young, which I think is accurate.
Yeah. I just think that there is this other thing happening as well.
Yeah.
Where I do playlists for my students where they get to pick games from a list to play for an assignment, and we do assignments of different lengths, so the games are going to be of different scopes. So we do everything from like the video game version of poems that you display for under an hour to AAA games. But in the sort of intermediary step, I've been assigning like visual novels and those kinds of games, and I've been thinking that this is something that's new and different, and maybe the students won't really recognize this as video games, and they are going to just not like the experience. But I find more and more that they are perfectly comfortable with this type of game, and they've already played visual novel style games before, and dating sims and whatnot. So there are things simmering in the youth culture out there that when I think I'm leading them off the trodden path, they're already off the path and exploring and finding things. So I think there's something hopeful about that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's helpful to get pushed back into that mindset, because it can be easy to forget, maybe anyone younger than us might not know this or be aware of this, but there was a time when no one really knew what a video game was supposed to be. And I think that's still true to a certain sense, but it can be easy to forget because there's such a tradition of understandably trying to codify it and just trying to get this big widespread belief that yes, you should only color within these lines. So I have one last question for you, unless there's something else you wanted to bring up, because I know I have just been jumping around a bit and we've touched on a lot of topics and may have jostled something in your brain that you didn't get a chance to say.
No, it's fine. I've got time for about one more. So.
Okay, well, so I'll make it a big one and I'll make it count. What have video games accomplished? That can count as your answer, by the way.
Well, I think maybe they killed TV.
Interesting.
I mean, I think they were an important part of network TV almost not being a thing in the younger generations anymore. And I do see it takes different sort of expressions, but I do see how younger people in particular aren't necessarily just content with passively taking in cultural media content anymore. They expect to be able to interact and answer back and all these kinds of things. And I think video games played a part in that. It's sort of the thing that I first found magical about computers the first time I touched the keyboard was that what I was typing actually showed up on screen. And it was just putting me just closer to the center than television broadcasts had been doing, because the TV just did not see me in any way. I was just seeing it. And this TV screen that was connected to a keyboard, it heard me and it saw what I was typing in, and that's a big part of what's cool about video games. I think that they react to you, and I think media experiences have become much more like interactive in that sense. So I guess I'm gonna give that to video games. I don't know if it's good or bad.
That's a separate question, but
Yeah.